welcome to a very special interview with Bobby Schroeder, otherwise known as Ponet, the creator of Super Lesbian Animal RPG. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I usually use they or she pronouns.
Terrific. So, I'm here to talk to you today about Super Lesbian Animal RPG and a little bit about its origins as well. Super Lesbian Animal RPG is a project you've been working on for a few years.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about the project, just to start us off?
So Super Lesbian Animal RPG is an RPG Maker project I've been working on and off pretty inconsistently since 2013, beginning of. I released it under a different title in the end of 2013. I worked on some other things in 2014, and then I picked it back up, started remaking it with new characters in 2015, and announced it at the end of that year. So it's a RPG, made an RPG Maker starring a character named Melody Amaranth, who's transgender, and she's recently become a paladin, so that she can go on adventures with her girlfriend Allison and their friends Claire, who is a witch, and Jody, who is a knight. And obviously all of them are animals, hence the title. And they're all inexperienced adventurers that kind of get roped into a situation that's much, much beyond their scope of experience, and they just kind of have to figure out what to do from there.
All right. Super Lesbian Animal RPG, you mentioned that it had, like, this kind of original release, something of a first draft, essentially, and that was Super Lesbian Horse RPG.
Yes.
And can you tell me a bit about that project?
So it's interesting that you call it a first draft, because people are often kind of confused about, like, what the remake is in relation to the original game, and I think that's a pretty good way to put it. It started out as a fan game using My Little Pony characters, because, I was a big fan of the show. I still kind of am, but especially back in, like, 2013, I was a big fan of the show. And so one day I was just like, man, I wanted to go to college for game design and whatnot, but that didn't really work out as I planned. So I'm like, I should just start making a game on my own. And RPG Maker was an easy enough tool to start learning with. So I just kind of started messing around, and within like 2 days, the basics of the beginning of the game were down, and it just kind of evolved into this weird jokey mess that, as it went on, got less jokey and more sincere. And it was a very strange project in hindsight.
So you basically what you're saying is that you learned to develop games kind of from scratch for this project, right?
Yeah.
What was that process like? Like, what brought you to that point where you decided, oh, I really want to make a game about this, but I don't know anything about game dev. I guess I'll start here. What was that whole process like?
I guess I kind of just learned about it as I went. Like, it helps that I have this massive crutch with RPG Maker, because I don't have to do a lot of coding per se. I can do, like, scripting for events and cutscenes and kind of set things up to run the way I want, but I don't have to go into the engine and render how it arranges tiles and stuff like that.
Right.
So I've kind of picked up through osmosis. I think I've mostly been learning about the design level of things, and, like, how to structure things and pace things, and just, like, storytelling principles for games rather than the programming side of things through this, which has been a pretty good experience. I just kind of pick up things mostly through, like, if I'll have some problem with something, I just Google it, or like, there's YouTube resources for everything, and especially lots of, like, critiques of existing games on YouTube from people like Errant Signal, or like Matthew Matosis, or what have you, Game Maker's Toolkit, and more recently, you can just watch these videos and, like, see what they have to say about games that are already out there, and you'll learn so much about design principles and, like, do's and don'ts.
Super Lesbian Horse RPG being a like fan project, especially for something like My Little Pony, did you feel that like you or your audience kind of took that any less seriously, just like on the basis that it's a fan project?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's kind of like this double-edged sword because when you're doing something with established characters, you can, first of all, like people are already familiar with the characters, so you don't really have to waste time introducing them. You can just go. And also, you can show people this game and be like, hey, you guys like these characters. Here's this game with these characters that you like in it. But then you aren't really going to get new fans based on that too much. Like, nobody who didn't already like My Little Pony is probably going to give a game about Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash being gay and going on an adventure a second chance. They're just gonna like scroll past it, like, I don't care about this, even if I try to elaborate, like, no, well, it's actually in this original world and not in the world of the show, and there's a bunch of original characters and enemies and like this whole original story that I came up with, and I was really only using the characters because I like them, and it's not a weird brony fan fiction thing, and that's the hardest part, because the brony fandom unfortunately is really, it's a weird community and it's gotten a lot of stigma, you know, not to harsh anyone's vibe or anything, but it's like there's been some very weird things that come out of that fandom that make it hard to present some like totally innocent My Little Pony fan content and be like, no, it's not weird, I swear.
Yeah, I know firsthand. I was in the shit. I was there. It was like the whole evolution of that fandom was just, it was completely whack. Like, the fact that it existed to begin with, the fact that, like, so many people got so into the show was, first of all, just indicative of the show's quality. And then, gradually, it got weird.
I think it started to get really weird as, like, it became this weird clash as social justice started to get more of a big thing on the internet. Like, people started to get more educated on these issues, and women in the fandom, especially like teenage girls and like women who had grown up with My Little Pony, started to kind of be like, I don't know, this is a little weird, and it just kind of got really toxic. Oh god, especially in like 2013, like right when I was making the game, that was like really when people started to kind of jump ship and be like, it's not worth it. It's not worth it for watching this cartoon.
I have the most like vague memories of all of that happening.
Oh god, yeah.
It's so bizarre to like reflect on, and I still really love the show.
Yeah.
I think it's really great, especially those first few seasons. I will admit I haven't like kept up with it since. I wonder if what contributed to that also was like the creators began to pander to this aspect of the fandom that was getting really weird and toxic and kind of ruining everyone's experience. And I wonder how much that kind of dragged everything back, you know?
Yeah, a little, I think. It kind of seemed like the Brony community, like the male fans, especially in the fandom, really thought that there was something particularly special about the fandom when it was just like, you know, just a pretty normal, if very active and passionate fandom for any cartoon. It's like, it's not, like they got whole documentaries about it, but it's not weird for adults to be watching a kid's cartoon in this day and age. Like everyone watches Adventure Time. Shows like that, Steven Universe, regular show, whatever. It's just, they kind of felt like they were owed more by the show just for showing up. And then,
well, I mean, that the way I interpret that is the show was seen as like a girls' club.
Yeah.
And it was this huge infiltration of, well, I say infiltration that makes it sound really gross. It kind of was, but it was this huge movement of guys suddenly wanting into the girls' club. And because they got in, they wanted like a cookie for it.
Yeah, it's like the show definitely played into that, where they'd start referencing more fandom memes and stuff. Not like hugely, except for like one episode that was like all fandom memes, but they started kind of pandering a little bit to them. It was just, I don't know, it was just kind of a mess from like 2012 onwards, really.
Brings me back a bit.
Yeah, same.
I want to get back to Super Lesbian Horse RPG a little bit more.
Yeah, of course.
The way I kind of understand it, stuff like this, like the process of taking like Super Lesbian Horse RPG and bringing it into its own original thing, like Super Lesbian Animal RPG. It's a pretty rare thing to happen in like any media, and the most famous example I can think of this is 50 Shades of Grey, which infamously or famously, depending on how you want to look at that, it started out as fan fiction for Twilight. And whenever I've told that story or whenever I've heard it told, it's always been this like really, really negative thing. So what I want to know is, can you talk about a little bit of what motivated you to actually like go through the process? What made you arrive at that point where you wanted to take Super Lesbian Horse RPG and turn it into something original? What brought you there and why?
So, like, immediately after I finished Super Lesbian Horse RPG, which I finished on Christmas 2013, which was my birthday, and was a very bad decision because I spent my entire birthday frantically trying to fix bugs that people found in the game. I finished the game, and I immediately started working on my next project. That as soon as I had the idea for it and like one piece of concept art, I'm like, guys, I'm making this new game. And
this was Andromi, right? Just to
right,
be
right.
Clear?
That's a game I still want to make, but it's kind of on the back burner right now. So I announced that, and I'm like, all right, now I'm like a real game developer, and I just kind of I realized that I wanted to reincorporate a few things from Super Lesbian Horse RPG into future projects, or at least to be able to do that. But I realized that the game was kind of getting lost to the sands of time in a way partially because of legal issues with Hasbro, because I didn't think it would be a problem, but after the game came out, they started to remove uploads of the game to like Mediafire and whatever. And I didn't really think it would be that big of an issue because they'd only done that with like really big games that got coverage and like Game Informer and looked super professional and looked exactly like the show.
The one by Main 6, right? That
Yeah.
was Fighting is Magic, which then eventually also became its own original thing, and with the backing of Lauren Faust, the original creator of the show, no less.
Yeah, it was kind of the same thing. I didn't really openly talk about it much because I'd kind of moved on, and also because Hasbro didn't take down all of the uploads of the game, so I figured I was like on thin ice or something, and if I just didn't say anything about it, I could just ignore it and everything would be fine. But
that's a really weird position to find yourself in as a creator, isn't it?
It really was, because like I had it on like Mediafire, Mega Upload, and like my Dropbox, and they only took it down from Mediafire, but it was clearly like, yeah, here's Hasbro's lawyers taking it down because of their intellectual property. I didn't really understand. But also it was like, I wanted to be able to use these characters again, and I wanted people to know where they were from, but I couldn't really distribute the original game because of legal issues, and also I kind of realized that, like, for better or worse, it did look weird having my first game be like a My Little Pony shipping fanfiction in RPG Maker form, and like I'm still super proud of that product, but it's like part of me knew that people would be able to enjoy the story, and I would be more proud of it if it was something original, and like I'd be able to do more with it, and even if I had like new protagonists, then potentially if people liked the game, I could do more with them and tell more stories with them. And I guess it was really originally just for myself to kind of like just to reclaim the original game and make it more my story instead of being like something that used someone else's characters and that made it less original in most people's eyes.
So, as well, I want to now delve into the process of actually taking Super Lesbian Horse RPG, taking those bones that you had there, and making it into Super Lesbian Animal RPG. Can you talk a bit about that? What What'd you bring over? What did you decide to leave behind, besides the characters, of course?
Well, I think it's still kind of an ongoing process of me looking at a part of the game and going, all right, what can stay, what can go, what should I change? Because I don't want it to just be this thing where people look at it and go, oh, so it's got this, and this characters, and these are clearly these My Little Pony characters in reality. And also, just because it was a game I made when I was 19, and I didn't know anything about game design really, so it really showed in a lot of areas how amateurish it was. Like the first dungeon, the first half of it was basically just a straight line because I was like, I looked at the blank RPG Maker canvas and I'm like, what the hell do I do with this? What kind of shapes do I do to make a fun dungeon? And so I'm just like, oh, I know, I'll make it a joke. It's a bad dungeon. That's really funny. So
Oh no!
it wasn't that funny. I don't know. People, it's weird. I was originally just going to like replace the characters with new designs, switch all their names, and make like one of the first dungeon more fun to actually play, and like throw in a new dungeon like halfway through the game, and then like call it a day. And I was gonna go right back on to working on like quote unquote real projects because it was really just a personal project for me because I struggled with working on Andromi for a while because of course it was such a smart idea to go, all right, I made an RPG Maker game, now I can make something from scratch in Unity, perfect, I'm ready for that. So I just decided to start reworking things and Super Lesbian Horse RPG, and over time I just started changing more and more and adding more and more. I guess it really started with the characters and I started to think more about like, okay, these are my characters now, so I can like push their personalities in a direction that I want instead of having to cling to the original canon of My Little Pony because it's a completely different thing now. You know?
In that sense, was that a little bit freeing for you to be able to like be freed from the chains of like, oh, I have to stick to X established character and they act in this way, but now I can flesh them out in so many different ways. Was that like a really freeing experience for you?
Oh yeah, totally. Because I mean, I'd always get comments about like, oh, this one scene, they're a little out of character, and like, admittedly, they were sometimes because I was already taking liberties with the characters in some places, and just like I don't care about that aspect of the character. That's not really important to the story I want to tell, so I'll just use something different or just like kind of brush it under the carpet. But now it's like, no, these are my characters that I'm establishing, and they can't be out of character because this is the character. This is the only thing they've ever been, and this is establishing what they're like. And I can use that in a lot of. I feel like I can use that to tell a much more interesting and meaningful story than I ever could with someone else's characters, and I'm really enjoying the process of writing these characters. Like, I think especially in the wake of games like Night in the Woods, I've come to realize that you can add so many little details about characters' lives that are like true to real life, even in a fantastical video game with talking animals, and it's just really nice to see characters that like reflect your own experiences, and I think that's a big part of it. So like, I'll be like, oh well, this character kind of had like a crappy home life growing up, and that's why she's done like XYZ now in the present in the current storyline, and it's just allowed me to tell a much better story, I think.
It's a really, really fascinating process to like hear about. And I can only imagine how awesome it must have felt to be able to go through all of this.
I think in particular, one of the things I'm able to change that's a little more subtle, maybe. I don't know if it's either subtle or just blatantly obvious, but like being able to change the characters' voices, just the way they speak in general. Because like when they were My Little Pony characters, the My Little Pony is written very differently from how real people speak a lot of the times in ways that you might not immediately notice, just because it's a children's cartoon and the characters are supposed to be like adults, but they also kind of act like children to make them more relatable to kids. And now I can just totally ignore all of that, and these characters can just talk like the people I know.
I think it's one thing that I saw praise a lot in Night in the Woods, which you mentioned a little earlier here,
Mhm.
as well, was like how natural that like dialogue felt in that game, but also how much it like connected to internet speak, how we talk on the internet, how we have to phrase all of that, and how it felt really great to read still, but it also just felt like internet speak. And I thought that that's a really interesting way to approach dialogue like that. What do you think your approach to writing dialogue that you want to sound like natural and normal is?
I think it's kind of always a constant struggle because you want to convey certain things about the characters and you want to move the plot forward, and you also, uh, in my case, it's like a kind of a comedy game, so there's like jokes I want to put in, but I don't want them to sound like they're just reading off of a script, like things that were predetermined to say. I always want it to feel smooth, like transitioning from one topic to another. And I also am paying very close attention, trying to make these characters actually sound like they're friends, because I think that's something I kind of struggled in the original game with. I I think I kind of got away with making them more belligerent with each other for the sake of jokes, just because like they're from a cartoon where they are all best friends and you can just go into the game knowing this already.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to flesh out a little better, like why do these characters like each other, like what their dynamic is and how that comes across just in casual conversations. And I don't know, I think kind of I'm constantly revising the script to kind of tweak little lines here and there, and I think it's really lucky that I'm not making a game with voice acting, because I would just suffer having to turn in a finished script months before the game is done, because I'm always changing things to make it sound more natural or add in a funnier joke or whatever to random bits of dialogue on a treasure chest, some random spot in the game or whatever.
Yeah, I remember Scott Benson mentioning before Night in the Woods launched as well that the reason that they didn't have voice acting for Night in the Woods was that the word count was legendary, quote
Oh
unquote.
god. Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's the writing in that game is so extensive. Do you feel like you're trying to go for a really extensive writing approach even in this like smaller scale project?
Yeah, I think I am. I mean, I'm adding a lot more player choice this time around. Not like in a you can completely change the ending way, but more like there's never going to be like a scene that's longer than 10 lines where you can't at least choose something for Melody to say. And there's lots of little bits of story spread throughout the world where you can find just little optional content that might add a little side story to enhance your knowledge of the characters in the world, and just lots of little things like that all over the place. I think that's kind of
Hmm.
like one of the most fun things for me to do with the game, really.
Is figure out player choice?
Well, just to like, kind of flesh out the world and the story and put lots of little things for players to find. Like
Right, okay.
that was kind of one of the things I had the most fun with in the original game, was putting all sorts of weird stuff as like Easter eggs and just kind of giving players a little playground to run around and find all these weird little things.
Hmm. Um, let's go back a little bit in the conversation to the process of converting SLH RPG into SLA RPG.
Mhm.
I mentioned earlier that like 50 Shades of Grey example,
Right.
and that being like the most well-known example of fan fiction being turned into something completely original. And I kind of wonder if there's a reason that more prolific fan work creators don't go through this process a lot. Like a lot of fan fiction just kind of stays as fan fiction. Do you think that there's a reason for it?
Um, I think it's something you're going to see more and more now, that it's like easier to put out content in the age of the internet. Like people are making way more games than they ever were in the past. People are putting all sorts of shows up on YouTube, and all sorts of webcomics and all these things. And I think a lot of the times people would like just kind of make something new in the spirit of the fan works that they'd made before, but now more people who do fan works to start out, which is like I think of extremely common thing these days, where you start out, you build an audience in a fan community, and then you go branch out into your own thing. You're just going to see more of that happening. Like a recent example that I found out about was the game Freedom Planet actually started out as a Sonic fan game, which might seem a little obvious just because of the gameplay there, but it literally was like a game with Sonic characters and everything, and then they just built it out into an original IP with new characters, and I think that really paid off for them.
Something like the Sonic the Hedgehog 4 that we all deserved, but
Yeah.
never got. Do you think that there's a stigma associated with the process of like turning fan work into original work? Because again, with that 50 Shades of Grey example, I mentioned that whenever I've told that story, it's always something to have like a chuckle at. Like, oh, look how bad this thing is. It used to be fan fiction.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
it seems to me like there's a stigma, but I also want to hear from the perspective of a creator what your take on that is.
I mean, there definitely is a stigma associated with fan fiction. I guess just because it's mostly made by like teenagers, and literally anyone can write a fanfic and put it up, and it doesn't have to be any good, and no one has to proofread it, and it can just be there, and thousands or millions of people can go read it. So like, I guess it's just, I don't know, there's just kind of a stigma associated with fan fiction in general, and I feel like knowing that something originated as fan fiction kind of has this connotation of it being really self-gratifying, maybe, in nature. But also I think with the example of 50 Shades, that's just, people don't really like Twilight to begin with in general, so I think anything based off of Twilight is also going to carry that stigma.
Do you fear that your game, which is based off of a My Little Pony fan project, might also carry a little bit of that stigma with it? Because, as you mentioned earlier, like, the MLP fandom has this reputation for making weird, really out there, and definitely sometimes gross shit.
Oh yeah.
So, do you feel like SLA RPG ends up carrying that stigma with it, or do you feel like you've, over the course of just developing out everything that SLA RPG is, do you feel like you've freed it enough from that stigma that you'll be able to escape?
I think anyone who actually looks at the project and like gives it a chance can tell how sincere it is and how much effort I'm actually putting into it. But I mean, I guess I kind of flip-flop back and forth based on my moods, like how much I want to let people know that it's based on a My Little Pony fan game, or like it's a remade version of a My Little Pony fan game I made when I was a teenager. Because like sometimes I'm like, yeah, I did that because I thought it would be a fun thing to do, and the show meant a lot to me personally, and I like the characters, and I thought, oh, I could do this with them. But it's largely this original thing, and I'm like freeing it from the shackles of being a My Little Pony fan game. And other days I'm like, people might just kind of think that's weird and not give the game a chance based on that. But I mean, also for me, there's the other factor there of the game already exists in an inferior form out there, so that people can just go on YouTube and find a full Let's Play of the game and see a worse version of the story and have like major plot points that some of which haven't been changed just spoiled for them. So a lot of times I'll like kind of skirt around the issue of name dropping the original game just so people don't go spoil themselves to that.
I've definitely noticed that in the process of like seeing you develop SLA RPG, that there's been this distancing of yourself a little bit from SLH RPG, and it's only a little bit. You still are like, you still talk about it on occasion, but I've definitely noticed it.
Yeah, I think part of it is also like just like you'll look at a project like Them's Fighting Herds and they never ever ever acknowledge that it started as a My Little Pony fan game, and I think that's just out of like being extra super careful that Hasbro doesn't come down on them again. And I'm kind of wondering, like, do I have to worry about that myself? So sometimes I'm like, just don't worry about it. There was a game this game existed in 2013 and it wasn't as good. Now I'm remaking it. Just look at the new one. Don't worry about it.
That's fair enough. How much of the, like, you mentioned a few plot points and stuff haven't changed from SLH RPG going into SLA RPG. How much of that DNA is still there? Like, if someone were to go look at like a Let's Play of SLH RPG, like you mentioned, how much would they be spoiling for themselves, mechanically or narratively?
It's hard to say exactly how much has changed, but it's definitely still recognizable. Like, I think people who loved the original game will go in and definitely still recognize all the things they loved about it in the new one. It's kind of a interesting thing to me because you'll always see remake projects of like the classics, and people will talk about preserving them and not changing too much. Like, they'll come out with the HD version of Wind Waker, and people will debate like, oh, did they really need to add the bloom and all these little changes to every little thing? So like, I think I can get away with changing more because it was an amateur project, and also just because I think I know what I want to do with it a lot better now. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see fans of the original respond to it. But it's definitely still there. Like, a lot of pretty much all the story wasn't really tied explicitly to it being My Little Pony characters. They were just like, kind of like character archetypes for me to work with. Like, you've got this shy, like, anxious girl who kind of overcomes her anxiety over the course of the story in some ways, and the more adventurous girl, and the girl who's got all the magical knowledge, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, it was never really inherently tied to it being My Little Pony, so a lot of it can come over. It's really just a matter of me making it better to play and a better story and expanding on it. Like, I've told people I don't think I'm removing that much, I'm just adding on to it. Like, you'll see, you can go through the forest area and you can recognize all the old level geometry there for the most part, but then there's just more areas to explore there. I think the gameplay is probably the one area that's changing the most, because I really did not have much of an idea what I was doing, and I'm trying to make it a lot more actually fun to play this time, making the encounters more satisfying, making it a little less grindy.
I mean, that seems like pretty important stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Speaking of gameplay and stuff like that, because now I want to shift away from talking about SLH RPG because it's very much in the past, and I did want to explore that process of, turning it from a fan project into something original. Now I want to look to the future. I want to look towards SLA RPG, which is coming out this year, right?
I am certainly aiming for it to come out this year. I mean, I would feel really bad if I didn't get it done by the end of the year. I gotta kind of pick up the pace with that, but hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully, releasing this year, 2017. So let's look towards SLA RPG, and let's talk about your biggest inspirations. Specifically, what are your biggest inspirations for the improvements that you've made to start out?
I think, like, gameplay-wise and level design, I'm definitely looking a lot to the Legend of Zelda series, because, quite frankly, a lot of JRPG classics, like your Final Fantasy and whatnot, don't have the most interesting level design. Like, an average dungeon in Final Fantasy will often literally just be a maze with some treasure chests and some enemies in it. So I'm trying to make things a little more interactive. I'm trying to make it more like like your Link to the Past and your Link's Awakening, where you go back and you get some kind of new ability, and that'll give you the tool to explore more of the world and find more of the secrets all around it.
Mm-hmm.
And also the dungeons in particular, I'm definitely trying to make a lot more interactive and just make them more interesting to explore.
Can you also talk about your core inspirations, not just what's like inspiring the new stuff that you're putting into SLA RPG, but what was the like base inspiration for everything that you're doing?
I think really the Mother series is the big one. I think my style has definitely shifted from that. I think the original game was more obviously inspired by Mother in some ways, maybe, but it's definitely there just as this kind of oddball RPG where there's like all these bizarre enemies and there's lots of goofy NPCs to find all around, but also like a sincere, if still kind of strange story to kind of guide everything along.
Do you ever worry about taking your inspiration too far? Like you mentioned that it was like very obvious that SLH RPG was influenced by the Mother series. Do you feel like there's a too far when it comes to like taking from your inspiration, or do you feel like there's maybe never enough that you can grab from all the inspirations and bring it in together to make this one thing? It's a difficult question. I've struggled with how to word it because I don't want it to like sound direct. I don't want it to sound like I'm accusing you of just like stealing inspiration from everywhere. Oh God, that's not what I want to convey here. I want to get a sense of like, do you feel like there's a too far?
I think there definitely is. I mean, it's kind of a constant balance of you. For me personally, with this project, it's not like I started out with a design document of everything I want to do and I just go. I'm kind of making it up as I go along with like a rough idea of what I'd like to do later, but it's always evolving. So it's very easy to kind of go in and go, oh, I can do this. Like in that one game that I like. And then I could like very easily just do that and then realize when people play the game like, oh, I just totally ripped that off, didn't I? So it's kind of like, I think there's a really good quote that I don't have the exact wording of from one of my favorite videos from George Weidman or Super Bunny Hop on YouTube was his review of what was it Jazz Punk, I believe, where he was a little more negative on the game than a lot of people were, and in the end he said that once you have to kind of like look at the things you love that inspire you and break them down like the core components of like why they work and not just what they do, and then once you know that, you can kind of use that as a framework to go off and build your own thing.
I guess to give an example of that kind of thinking, just like one that immediately came to me, would be Nuclear Throne, which, if I were to break down that into its core components of what makes that appealing, it is the pace, it is the sound, it is the satisfaction that every action gives you but that's a lot of that is just generated from the pace and sound and then the immediate impact of seeing everything happen. It's fast and really brilliantly designed. That's like the first example I can think of when I hear you talk about like thinking like that.
Yeah, I think it also helps for me personally that I'm not just trying to mimic any one thing. It's like I don't want to just say, oh, my game is a pastiche of other games, but it is in some ways. Like I take inspiration from a lot of things and also like TV shows and comics and whatnot, and not just like saying I'm going to make my Final Fantasy game and here is Cloud, but he's got blue hair this time or whatever.
Yeah, that seems just like a recipe for disaster. Just taking from any one single source and expecting that to succeed in a really, really meaningful way doesn't really make sense to me. Where if I were to look at something like I'll use Metal Gear Solid, for example. That takes a lot of examples from, like, proper film and television and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that, in addition to video game influences, and it combines this all into this really great, like, it's a really great series that's been long running. Um, I haven't played too much Metal Gear Solid, but its influences are quite clear.
No, definitely. Yeah, I kind of hope that um, not I'm not inherently trying to mimic any one game, but I hope that kind of taking elements I like from a lot of different things that inspire me, like the dungeon design, kind of pacing and structure and puzzle solving from the 2D Zeldas, and like the the sense of humor from kind of like, I might list point and click adventure games as an inspiration, just because I have a protagonist who talks, and like there's all these little things where you can just inspect a random object in Melody's house or whatever, and you'll get some weird little observation from her. But and also like visual elements from a lot of different things. Like I think the Kirby series is a big inspiration for me, with the use of lots of colorful patterns and kind of abstract shapes rather than trying to make everything look particularly realistic, and all sorts of little elements like that. I hope it comes together into a nice package overall with like my original story on top of it.
Mm-hmm. On that kind of note, in your press kit that you have for SLA RPG, you mentioned that, quote, SLA RPG has been a labor of love and is designed through and through to be the game I've always wanted to play, but no one else has made yet. Can you elaborate on exactly what you mean by that?
I mean, it's definitely. I think the story is a big part of it. I don't want to undersell any one element of the game, but the story is definitely clearly the main focus of it. I mean, a lot of it definitely comes down to like representation issues, because I've never really played a game with a trans protagonist, and there aren't a lot of games about gay relationships and that sort of thing. And I'm, I just kind of, I really like, that's kind of part of the reason why I made Super Lesbian Horse RPG to begin with, and why I was so enamored with like My Little Pony shipping content at that point in my life, because like there just wasn't a lot of media like that out there, so people were making it themselves, and it like really spoke to me to see those kind of stories just being told anywhere. I just want to see those stories told more in general. It's nice to see games and cartoons and comic books and everything where it feels like people like you actually exist. Like it was pretty unheard of to have gay relationships in cartoons just a few years ago, and now we've got shows like Steven Universe and The Legend of Korra and everything that are just doing that on television. I think it's really nice to have stories like that, and I think I'd like to see more of that in video games, but people are kind of, it's just kind of taking a while to get to that point, partially because of the environment of gaming culture right now, I guess, but also just because there aren't that many people like us in the industry right now. So it's kind of a process getting to that point.
It's been really interesting to see the amount of like trans creators who have been like popping up among the gaming community recently. It's been really, really great to see all of that. And it's also very, very cool to see people like Robert Yang who are talking like openly about like gay sexuality, more specifically gay male sexuality, and like making games about that. And it's this really fascinating process to see the rise of like LGBT creators and LGBT creations within the context of games. It's also quite interesting to think about Nier Automata and Nier specifically as well, because I'm thinking back to some quotes that I've seen from Yoko Taro, who talks about just like, oh yeah, there's like an intersex character in Nier because people like this exist.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really great rise to see, and I hope we see that continue. Um, I want to ask you on that note about something as well. Um, can you talk to me a little bit about the choice to make a game that was explicitly about LGBT characters? Did you feel like that was a risk in this like current gaming climate? Even though we've made so many like advancements and stuff, we are still in a climate which is inherently toxic to women, to LGBT people.
Yeah, I mean, I it's definitely a little scary to put out a game like this, even when it's just a small RPG Maker project that I'm going to put out on itch.io for less than $10. It's like there's definitely people who will just see that and go, "Oh, well, you're pandering. That means I have to send you death threats." So like, it's a scary environment, but I don't think it was ever really a conscious choice to make the game be about that because I am trans and bisexual, like that, it was never going to be a game about anything else. I would never really like this. Just kind of my default mode of writing. People, it's always funny seeing the reaction because people are always like, "Oh, this is a game about animal characters who are gay." That's like, whoa, I'm on the weird part of YouTube now. Oh, I gotta log off. This is really bizarre. What were you smoking to come up with that? And I'm like, that's just like the most normal concept in the world to me.
Yeah,
It's
like even within like furry culture specifically, we like see a lot of like there's a fair deal of LGBT positivity. There's obviously like a lot of bad seeds, but within the context of like furry fandom, we still see like a lot of inherent LGBT like positivity. We see perhaps a lot of that in the circles that we both run in,
yeah.
respectively. Just like being with our friends and being with ourselves as well, and existing and wanting to see stories like this told.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might seem like kind of an out there concept to people, but I think almost all the people I know who I'm like friends with on the internet are like, "Oh, a game where you can play as a transgender bisexual fox girl. That's perfect. That's exactly what I've always wanted." And like, a really good example is the game Gone Home, which I played not too long after it came out, and it really spoke to me just to hear a character in a video game say that like she tried coming out to her parents, and they weren't like disowning her, but they're like, well, you think you're that way, but it might just be a phase, honey. And like that was an experience I lived through myself, and like, you know, no shade to my mother, I love her, but
Yeah, that's the fucking realest feeling in the goddamn world right now.
oh god, yeah,
I'm
like
I'm in that like headspace again, just
mm,
hearing you talk about it.
yeah, like it's such a powerful thing just to have characters in any medium, but I feel like games especially because of the way they're interactive and you're kind of existing as another person for a while you play them, just to hear characters kind of acknowledge that the stuff you've been through in your life is something that other people have gone through and they came out the other side okay.
hmm It's really important that stuff like this exists. So I'm really glad that you are taking the steps to make that happen.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn so much and act like it's the most revolutionary game I've ever made. I'm sure there's other indie games out there about trans people that I just haven't played because there's like thousands of games being released on Steam these days, and it's like a flood of content, and there's tons of good stuff out there that I've just never heard of. But like, I just hope in some small way some people can play the game and they can relate to my characters and they can have a fun time, they can laugh at the jokes, and they can come out the other side feeling a little better about themselves maybe, or at least knowing that there's other people like them out there.
So, with SLARPG as well, what do you think is the most important thing you are trying to accomplish with SLA RPG? This is a really tough question, so please feel free to take time to think about it.
No, yeah, these aren't the softballs.
What do you think is the most important thing that you are trying to accomplish, or at the least a few important things, whether they're like the most or just like little things that you feel are really important to nail down? What's important to you about this game, and why you're making it?
I think one of the smaller aspects that I'm happy with is the fact that I'm telling a story about a relationship that isn't just like a lot of the times in video games, romance will be there's a character that you can pursue a romantic relationship with, you give them gifts, and then that unlocks the kiss scene, and then that's the end of the story, happy ending, the end, it's over, go home. And like I enjoy telling stories where the characters are they're already in a relationship and they're kind of figuring out how to keep going with their lives, like, and continue being in that relationship, and not just treating getting to the relationship as like a victory state for the game.
Mm-hmm. Do you think games like Stardew Valley and Harvest Moon have a particular problem with that? Because I look at the design of stuff like that and I think that's a little whack.
It's a little. I mean, I'll give them credit that like I think it's just a design decision more than anything, because or a design challenge that they face, because they have to figure out how to keep having a story there once you have a spouse who just kind of helps out on the farm, and like you don't have to actively go out and try to woo them. I don't know. It's tricky. I feel like this right now this is kind of inherently part of the way the game is structured, and they'll have to get creative to figure out how to avoid doing that, if they even bother doing it, because like I mean people generally like Stardew Valley. It's a good game. It's always kind of interesting to see that it's a game where it's like I don't think it's any sort of statement. It's just kind of a silly thing where it's like you just hand them a present and it's like, I like you more now.
It is definitely a design challenge, because you run up against this idea where you have to gamify, quote unquote, like a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot that you have to turn into like something which can be like quantified and measured in the game. And various games take different approaches to this. Like Dragon Age Origins had this system where you could give people gifts and it would raise their approval or disapproval rating, or like say different things, take different actions, and they'd approve or disapprove of you less. And it was this weird quantifiable thing, but it has to be quantifiable because it's a game, and it's this bizarre struggle to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking out loud here a little, but I think partially the other problem with that, at least in Stardew Valley's case, might be that the protagonist does not speak in that game, so they probably have trouble trying to figure out how to make the relationship feel more in depth, because you can't really talk to them, and they're just kind of talking at you, and then you give them presents, and the meter goes up, and then eventually you can propose to them, and it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just something you got to figure out ways to work around slowly but surely over the course of iterating it over different games in the same genre.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to SLA RPG as well, I want to ask you specifically about characters.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a favorite character that you're writing for SLA RPG right now? And what is making them your favorite character right now, if it's possible for you to talk about this without spoiling some stuff?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love writing all the characters, because I've created them specifically to be characters that I would love writing. But I think the easiest one for me to write might be Claire, the witch, for anyone who isn't super familiar with the characters yet. She's the third party member. She's a witch, and in the story, at the beginning of the game, she builds a training dungeon, and Allison's basement for them to kind of test out their abilities in, completely without Allison's permission, and they think it's a horrible idea, but she's like, no, it'll be fun, it's great, it's going to be this great test of your abilities. It's fun to write her because she's kind of a wild card, and she's extremely irresponsible about magic, and she's never really run into a mess that she hasn't been able to get out of with her magic. So her big goal in life is to become a like famous successful witch. So she'll do like anything to get there, as long as it's not like going against her morals or anything. So she'll totally like build a dungeon out of Allison's basement, or like go off someplace she definitely should not be, just in case she finds any cool ancient artifacts or like all this stuff. It's just fun to write a character who causes so much trouble for everyone around her in like a funny way, and not like a, oh god, we really hate Claire and she's making our lives miserable constantly way.
Small inconveniences, but always stuff that you can like look back on and laugh at, basically, right?
Yeah. I also like writing Allison, the second main character of the game, who's Melody's girlfriend. She, honestly, I could just write her rambling about some random nonsense and for like sentences and sentences, and it would just be fun for me. And I'm constantly finding myself like kind of having to fight that, to not make random bits of dialogue on random objects or like with random NPCs way too long with Allison, because she loves the sound of her own voice sometimes.
So with all this, let's talk about Super Lesbian Animal RPG. Where do you think you're gonna go next from here?
Oh,
Where do you see yourself as a creator? Do you want to like continue working on some smaller scale stuff like SLA RPG, or do you see yourself moving on to perhaps some bigger things after this?
I mean, it's hard to say. You know, Super Lesbian Animal RPG and the original game were supposed to be very, very small projects that I was just doing for fun as kind of a learning process. And they inevitably became much, much larger as people showed more interest in them and I got more ideas for them. So I think I'd like to do some smaller projects. I think I'd like to learn other engines like Game Maker, so I can make games that aren't structured like this, and like RPGs or like games where you walk around on a top-down environment and inspect things or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. I have the game Andromi that I announced extremely prematurely that I like to make in some form, because even though it was larger than I probably should have committed to making a game at that point, I still have a lot of ideas and characters that are interesting there that I want to work with as like a sci-fi futuristic adventure game. But also I feel like a lot of at least some of the themes that I wanted to work with in Andromi have kind of wormed their way back into Super Lesbian Animal RPG just naturally. So I'm not really entirely sure what I'm going to do with that next. I'd also definitely like to do more with these characters in the future if people are interested in that. That was a big reason why I wanted to remake the game in the first place, was so that instead of it being this weird little fan fiction project kind of that I couldn't really touch anymore, it would be like, no, here's like the origin story for this group of friends who become adventurers, and like if guys like that, then like, hey, I could go make a platformer starring Allison or whatever. I could make some visual novel about an NPC in town. Who knows? Like, I have no idea, honestly. I've always kind of been a creator who always has too many projects going at once and too many ideas, and I just kind of go based on whims of like what I think is a good idea at the time, and I just roll with it. So we'll see, but I definitely want to do more. I don't know if I'd want to make a game as big as Super Lesbian Animal RPG immediately next, because like it's not that huge of a project, but it is going to be a game that's like 4 or 5 hours long, and that's pretty big for a first game. Even if I did release it in another form already, so it's technically my second game. I don't know, but yeah,
I mean, it's just had a first draft, like I mentioned at the top of the interview.
yeah, that's definitely a good way of putting it.
I want to ask you something as well about the process of actually making SLA and SLH RPG happen,
Mm-hmm.
because SLA RPG it's been a couple of years in the making now.
Yeah.
So, what has kept you motivated to keep coming back to this project and keep working on it?
Oh god, I mean, partially it's the not fun answer of this is my job now. So if I stop making it, then I don't get to sell it and I don't get to make money. That's not the fun answer. Part of it is definitely fan feedback, because I really want to get the game in people's hands, and I want people to get acquainted with the characters and their stories. And I always love seeing fan art from people and just hearing people like say that, oh, I love this character, can you tell me more about them, and that sort of thing. Like I didn't really expect the game to pick up as much steam as it has. Like it's not like a Night in the Woods or an Undertale where it's like, wow, this is dominating the blogosphere right now, but it's like people are definitely interested. I'm up to making like $300 a month on Patreon, which is much more than I figured I'd be making at this point on Patreon. I'm like, wow, people are really into the idea and into the characters, and that it's really nice. The other thing I'd say is the soundtrack, honestly, which I have several friends working on. The soundtrack is just turning out so good, and I want people. I'm like, I hear the song and I'm like, oh man, that part in the game is gonna be so cool when the song is playing, and I really want people to actually like see that, But I can't do that until it's done. So I'm like, oh, I gotta keep working. I can't just show people the final boss theme like a year before the game is done and be like, hey, isn't this so cool? Like I actually have to have the whole scene in place so people can see what's in my head and understand like, wow, this is a really cool part. At least I hope it turns out cool. We'll see. The original final boss fight wasn't very good because I feel like I was literally like one of the last things I worked on, and it was super rushed. So yeah.
So to quickly just bring this all together, close this off a little bit more before we step into the area of taking some questions from your fans, because I have a couple sitting in my inbox right now. What are some games that are not Super Lesbian RPG that you would consider totally essential to play?
It's kind of hard to say because I have fairly specific tastes. Well, maybe not the most specific, but I have my tastes, and I'm always going to be like, oh, this game is great, but there's always going to be people who say, no, that game's awful. What are you talking about?
If you didn't have any reservations about that, what would you recommend?
I definitely recommend the Mother series, just because I feel like it's been really influential. Like, there weren't that many games, console games especially, back then that were so strange and so humor focused, but also so sincere about its characters and so interested in depicting the real world, or at least a world that resembles our own more than a world like the Mushroom Kingdom or Hyrule or whatever would. In recent years, one of my favorite games has definitely been Undertale, which is in a similar vein, and that's probably not too surprising. It was funny. I saw a forum thread that had been going since like 2013 of people talking about Super Lesbian Horse RPG and then the remake a bit once they announced it. And they said that Undertale reminded them of my game, and that was like such a huge compliment to me. It's just Undertale has been sort of an inspiration to me, not in like the obvious ways of like, oh, I'm adding a mode to the game where it's like a pacifist mode, but more like just the way it was able to so efficiently sell you on liking those characters. It's like it's kind of the gold standard for that for me. Like the way I was so emotionally attached to Toriel by the end of like the first half hour of the game was like really impressive to me for a game that I knew almost nothing about before I started playing it.
Mm-hmm. Any other essentials in your list?
I've played some Shovel Knight lately and really enjoyed that. I mean, that's been a favorite for a few years now, but I think I might recommend that just because it's a really good example of a game that takes very blatant inspiration from some of the classics, but also makes it its own thing. That's kind of like the way it takes bits of like Zelda 2 and the Mega Man games and DuckTales, but it's like it's not really just like that straight up. It's got its own ideas and its own story and its own little world and its own mechanics, and it brings elements of the things that inspire it together in ways that feel like a fitting tribute to this game and not just ripping it off. And I think that's something I kind of aspire to myself.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now we get to dip into the fan question portion.
Oh boy.
I've got 3 questions. The first comes to us from Anonymous. We'll call them Jack Black. Jack Black asks, what music taste does every member of the cast have? Presumably talking about SLA RPG. Maybe pick just a couple characters, talk about what you think their music tastes might be.
Yeah. I'll definitely stick to the party members just because there's a lot of NPCs that I'm like, I haven't really thought about what music they'd listen to.
Oh, God, yeah.
I always get so many questions like this about the party members that I've thought about this a lot. So, like, Melody, I feel like this is kind of reflective of her as a character in many ways. She hasn't entirely developed her own tastes. She just kind of listens to what's popular, and she's not, like, confident in her ability to really, like, know what kind of music she likes and like go out and seek out more of that. So I imagine her really liking Carly Rae Jepsen though.
Mm-hmm.
Allison definitely listens to a lot of punk rock because that's just who she is. I feel like she'd also unironically listen to a lot of old ska. Claire, I've answered this question before. I'm trying to remember what I actually said. Claire would listen to like some old like prog rock or something, and also I don't know, Aphex Twin. Let's go with that.
That's a good choice.
Jody. Ooh. I haven't talked about Jody much because she's like the hardest character for me to write. Just because she's like the responsible one.
Yeah, that is. Let me tell you, that is an experience which is entirely unrelatable to me.
Yeah, I mean, she's taking the place of Applejack in the original game and is an entirely different character. Trust me, but I'm making her one of the aspects of her that I'm really enjoying writing now is that like in the original game, Applejack was pretty no nonsense about a lot of things. And in this game, Jody is like totally unfazed by the things Claire does and like the trouble she causes for everyone. And she's kind of like the motherly friend who's like, yeah, Claire, you go, you follow your dreams, even though she's like nearly burned her house down or something. But what music does she listen to? That's the actual question here.
Can I make the obvious joke? Eye of the Tiger.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know. Jody just listens to general rock music, what's ever on the top 40. I don't know. I have to think about that more.
Top 40 is like all EDM now.
Well, like top 40, like there's like a rock
top 40 from like the
Billboard
1990s, maybe.
Yeah. She just listens to Nirvana constantly. There we go.
Perfect. I have another question from a writer, and I have to, or someone who's interested in writing, and I have to figure out a name for them. I'm going to call them Catherine Lasky. Catherine Lasky asks, what was the most fun dialogue to write while creating Super Lesbian Horse RPG? I really loved that game and the dedication that was put into it.
Well, thank you. Um, so I feel like it's partially the same answer where in the original game, Claire was Twilight Sparkle from My Little Pony, and I wrote her very, very out of character in a lot of places. So she was a lot of fun to write there for similar reasons. Although I've taken the things that were fun to write her, like I've taken the aspects that were fun to write with her and extrapolated them into like more of Claire's personality instead of being like, oh, well, she's just being kind of weird this week. I don't know what she's doing. It's like, no, she's just like that all the time. It's great. I also really enjoyed writing the villain once I got more of an idea of what he's like, and I haven't name dropped him, but I'm spoilers, so I'm not really I'm not specifying details about him because that's all stuff that you'll just have to play the game to see. But I always enjoy doing kind of mischievous villains and like villains who will do the weirdest things to try to get the protagonists, and it's really fun. Like any game where, like, I think the Paper Mario series does a lot with that, where like there will be like a weird game show segment, like, okay, sure, let's do that now. I always enjoy doing that.
Paper Mario is like, if I were to design a game right now, Paper Mario would probably have the biggest influence on how that game was made.
Yeah, like I haven't
like
named
the
dropped
action
that, but I
command
think
system.
Paper Mario,
I still fucking love the action command system. It's so
oh
good.
God, yeah.
Sorry.
I almost wish I could do something more like that in RPG Maker, but I'm kind of working with the tools I have to try to make it more interesting. Like I'm kind of inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, even though that's like a goal that RPGs have been trying to live up to tabletop games for the entirety of computer RPGs existing, and it's never going to happen.
My dude, I'm looking at a poster for the Dungeons and Dragons Icewind Dale video game right on my wall right now.
God, see, I haven't played a lot of tabletop RPGs myself, but I have been listening to a lot of the Adventure Zone, and it's amazing how the weirdest tactics will work in a tabletop RPG, and you can just roll with that. And I'm kind of trying to evoke a little bit of that, where it's like, what if I use this spell on this enemy? Oh, actually, this enemy is extremely flammable, and now it's on fire, and it can hit you with fire attacks now. And it's like, oh, that's not good. So I'm trying to do stuff like that, where you try out different things in enemies, and you just kind of see what happens, and you roll with it, and you don't... I'm trying not to overuse any one enemy too much, because I feel like that fun goes away if you're fighting the same enemy 20 times. So I'm trying to make it like there's less fights, but they're all harder and a little more reactive to the weird things you can try to do on them to make it more fun. But yeah, Paper Mario is definitely a big influence on my writing, and I think that's honestly why I'd say people compared like people as in like 3 people on a forum compared Undertale to Super Lesbian Horse RPG, because I think we both just love Paper Mario so much and the jokes in that game, and like that's exactly what we're going for.
Even smaller things in that game really stand out to me, like stuff like how the text moves when like weird shit is happening. Like the text itself is moving up and down to try and convey the tone that is like being quote unquote spoken. And it's such a fascinating design decision to see all of that come together, as well as like the goofiness that can come from playing off of the fact that Mario is made of paper, like rolling him up into a tube or making him into a paper airplane. I love how all of that ties together. And for me, I think Paper Mario, again, it'd be like the thing that would influence any game that, if I were to make one, that would be it. It would be Paper Mario is the single biggest influence, and then I can pull in stuff from everywhere else, but it always comes back to Paper Mario.
Yeah.
I have one last question from another anonymous user, and we're going to call them Griffin McElroy. Griffin McElroy asks, do you vape?
Okay, first of all, no. Second of all, I'm pretty sure I know who sent this. I'll get you.
Oh,
That's all I have to say.
Good times. Good times online.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. It's been really, really great to be able to talk to you about the creation of SLH RPG and where you're going with SLA RPG, where you're going beyond that. Talking about all this stuff has been really, really great. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this with me.
No, thanks for having me. It's been fun. Hopefully for listeners out there, I didn't ramble too much and my points actually made sense because, I mean, I love talking about the stuff I make, but I'm not always the best about formulating my points on the spot. So
hey, we'll fix it in post. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, we'll fix it. We'll have Shigesato Itoi come in and post and make more interesting points about designing a comedy JRPG for me.
So where can people find you on the internet if they want to support Super Lesbian RPG's development, if they want to just follow you, keep up to date, see what you are talking about? Where can people find you online?
Well, I have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ponett, Ponett. I haven't been updating that as much as I should, but I do give behind-the-scenes things, like show off some things that are a work in progress, not quite ready, but like just giving a peek at ideas I have and things that I'm working on. I also am on Twitter at Ponett+, and there you can see all my ramblings about whether or not I can get away with mentioning fushigi balls in the game. I chose to have Allison just call them contact juggling balls with no brand attached, and there we go. So that joke works. I'm also on Tumblr at Ponett. That's probably the place where people know me from best. Although I don't post my random musings about fushigi balls there so much anymore. And yeah, so that's where you can find me. I guess I also, I don't know, I have a fur affinity. That's Ponett. If you're of that persuasion, I post art there sometimes. It's all safe for work, don't worry. But
Sweet.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Sweet. As I mentioned at the top of the interview, I believe, if I did not fix this in post, as well, I host a podcast. Normally, the podcast is called PauseCast, and it is a weekly show about video games. You can find that online at patreon.com/PauseCastShow, on Twitter at PauseCastShow, and you can find me online as Cockatiel Cutie, and at the amazing URL, and I always love to toot my own horn about this because it's so goddamn good, bird.school.
It's a very good URL.
It's a very good URL. Do you have anything you want to put out before we close off the interview here?
No, I don't know. I mean, I hope people think it's interesting to hear me talk about the game. I hope people enjoy the game. I've got I need to work on this more, but I've got a comic coming out actually that'll be about 10 pages long, I think, with the characters of the game, the main characters, establishing them, set like shortly before the events of the game. It's like a prologue to how the story started getting in motion, and I hope people enjoy that. I'll also have a demo shortly after that, hopefully, where you can explore a bit of the town, Greenridge, and you can also do about the first half of the first dungeon. And I hope people enjoy everything, and I hope I make enough money to live off of it.
I mean, it's a nerve-wracking prospect, but it's the dream.
It's the dream. It's going okay so far. Just, fingers crossed.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. I super, super appreciate you taking the time to come here and talk about SLA RPG with me.
Well, thank you.
For PauseCast, and on behalf of myself and Mark Hanna, thank you very much. And if you are interested in more discussions about video games, feel free to tune into PauseCast sometime. We would love to have you listen. Thank you very much, and have a great day, morning, night, whatever.